the CIA psychic who mapped an alien city under Antarctica. 48 South, 93 East, market, he says, eyes shut, voice flat. Black geometry under ice. Angles repeating. It's not rock. A chair scrapes. Someone curses. In the control room, alarms chirp from a heart rate monitor while a printer spits out crooked lines of lattice and hexes. Stop prompting, the case officer snaps. The viewer swallows. It's awake when the moon pulls. Silence. Then, there's a door that isn't a door. On the session log, a page number is circled. Later, that page will go missing. To understand why the room panicked, we need to go back to how this mission started. The green light, how the mission was authorized. It didn't begin with psychics. It began with a glitch in a satellite file and a rumor that wouldn't die. An analyst at a desk in a windowless annex flagged a pattern. Straight-line radar echoes under an East Antarctic ice dome where nothing straight should exist. Across the hall, another team had been listening to foreign chatter about subglacial installations. Nobody said alien. They didn't have to. The word non-human shows up later in pencil in the margin. Meanwhile, the budget war inside Langley was in full swing. Programs with clearer deliverables were slicing up the year's crumbs, and anything with anomalous cognition on the cover page drew smirks. But the satellite anomaly wasn't going away. It matched a line of older seismic reflectors that had baffled a field team 15 years earlier. Flat planes at consistent depths, repeating at 60 and 120-degree angles. Natural formations can be tricky. Nature doesn't love hexagons over kilometers. A small black project living under the Stargate umbrella saw an opening. If they could turn a blind target into coordinates, and those coordinates landed on the anomaly, they had leverage. The case officer, a quiet careerist who knew how to blend ambition with plausible deniability, made the pitch. One session, blind, no contamination, a low-cost probe into a high-cost question. If it failed, it vanished. If it hit, it bought time. There was pushback. The evaluation memos on remote viewing were always split down the middle. Lab hits in the 70% when conditions were loose, chance when the controls got tight. Useful in the wild? The official line said no, and a 1995 CIA-commissioned review concluded remote viewing was not operationally useful for intelligence. But off the record, people remembered the odd win, the detail that shouldn't have been knowable, the map pin that later made sense. The Cold War had trained them to chase whispers if there was even a hint the other side was chasing them too. The green light came with strings. Security protocols would be strict. Blind tasking, random code names, need-to-know briefings, zero sensory prompts. The case officer would pick a viewer with outlier accuracy and the rare ability to tolerate ambiguity without spinning elaborate narratives. He chose someone who rarely asked for feedback, who stayed sparse, who drew rather than spoke. The target pool would be masked behind a meaningless alphanumeric. No geography, no context, just describe the site known as Omega-3. Omega-3 was an internal, ad hoc codename for this tasking. It does not appear in any declassified program lists like Scanate, Sunstreak, or Stargate. Inside the skiff, the memo that mattered was short. Satellite anomalies observed near a deep ice dome. Correlation with legacy seismics. Potential strategic relevance unclear. Risk of foreign exploitation non-zero. In the margin, a note in the case officer's handwriting. Single session trial, then reassess. He'd learned the therefores. Initial skepticism at headquarters, therefore tighter controls. No leaks, therefore smaller team. Unusual targets, therefore blind everything. Stakes were argued without hyperbole. If a non-natural subglacial structure existed, it would upend threat models. Was it a buried installation? A relic? A hazard? Diplomacy would be tested because Antarctic treaties only hold when everyone agrees the ground is empty. Religion and culture would absorb the shock waves in unpredictable ways. That was the grand stuff. On paper, the stake was simpler. Don't get scooped by a rival. The intercepts suggested drones and magnetometers were already flying suspicious patterns near the coordinates their satellites couldn't quite resolve. The selection meeting for the viewer lasted 10 minutes. The list was short. The final question the case officer asked was never about belief. It was about noise. Could the viewer keep their own expectations quiet long enough to let the signal, if there was one, surface? He slid the envelope across the table. The viewer didn't touch it. That was protocol. They'd only open it when the room was sealed, when the cameras rolled, when the pen was ready to move and the heart rate strap was snug. Before the door closed on that first. Session, the handler ran the checklist. No sensory cues, no yes/no steering, no leading metaphors. If the viewer spoke in poetry, they'd ask for a sketch. If the sketch got mushy, they'd ask for a texture. If the texture drifted, they'd pause. A monitor analyst, the sort who dated every post-it and sharpened pencils to identical points, set up the printer. Line drawings were easier to compare later, to whatever the data team dug up. The last hurdle was money. Someone had to pay for the time, the analysts, the air gap in the data closet. The case officer found a sliver in a research line item labeled Biophysical Interactions. It sounded like diet studies. It covered enough. All along, a parallel conversation ran under the official one. Why Antarctica? Why risk the credibility of a controversial program on a target buried under miles of ice? The case officer's answer was cold. Nobody could get there quickly. Nobody could stage a photo op. If anything surfaced, it would surface as physics first, magnetics, gravity, sound, before ideology could stamp it. When the approval finally came, it arrived as a calendar invite and a badge list. No fanfare. No memo titled Alien City. Just a time, a room, a set of initials. The viewer would sit, hear the target cue, and let whatever came come. Prove nothing, the case officer told himself. Don't reach. Let the data argue. But as he walked down the hall, he thought about those straight lines under ice and the foreign drones skating the edges of the treaty zones. The envelope landed on the table. The camera's red light switched on. In the control room, the analyst checked the printer one more time and glanced at the heart rate monitor. Not because it mattered, but because in this line of work, bodies always tell you when a story is about to turn. The first session, a city with no doors. The envelope opens with the soft rip of glued paper. The viewer doesn't look at it. They just place a fingertip on the cue card like it's a switch. Omega-3, the handler reads. Describe the site. A breath. Then the pen moves. No searching lines, no warm-up spirals, clean strokes, nested shapes. Pressure, the viewer says. Cold. Angles too precise, like mathematics became architecture. On the other side of the glass, the monitor analyst leans in. The printer begins its slow, ratcheting hum. Geometric lattice, he writes on a sticky note. Repeats, scale unknown. The heart rate alarm chirps once, then steadies. The case officer keeps his voice flat. Stay with the site. Empty air, the viewer murmurs. But the air isn't air. It's slow. The pen taps, then carves hexagons into hexagons, corridors within corridors. Nested. No curvature. No doors. He pauses. No doors. The handler starts to speak. The case officer cuts him off with a finger. The viewer's jaw tightens. Low-frequency hum. It's not sound. It's weight pretending to be sound. They slide a blank sheet forward. The viewer rotates it 90 degrees and draws a long spine with ribs at 60-degree intervals, then overlays a honeycomb cross-section. The analyst scrawls a question mark next to 60/120. To the case officer, it looks surgical. Edges too sharp to be random, repetition too clean to be geology. Complication arrives as a tremor in the pen hand. The heart rate ticks up, the alarm chirps again. Request to shift elevation. The viewer says, eyes still closed. I'm too close to the plane. I need above. The handler glances at the case officer. A tiny nod. Shift elevation. Describe from above. Black geometry, the viewer says. Absorbs light that isn't there. Vitrified surfaces. Glass but not glass. Sharp edges, no tool marks. The pen shades in dark facets along the spine. Built to resist time. The word hangs in the room. The analyst types it anyway. A micro-story writes itself in the margins. The printer coughs, spits a crooked page. The analyst catches it, smooths it, and circles the lattice. He draws a tiny human stick figure next to a corridor and writes scale, then erases the figure. He doesn't know why that feels wrong. Move inside, the case officer says gently. If there is an inside. The viewer exhales. Inside, but nothing welcomes. There are chambers like integers, discrete, exact. No handles, no seams. A hum behind the hum, down in the bones. The handler asks for textures. Smooth, the viewer says. Not polished. Like glass that's been heated until it forgot it was glass. No dust. Cold pressure. I'm not supposed to be here. The analyst's pencil stutters. A corridor grid becomes a map. Angles at precise increments, junctions recur at regular distances. He writes scale unknown again, darker this time. On a fresh sheet. The viewer draws a central void with spokes radiating out. Hollow, he says. But the hollow is doing work. Work how? The case officer asks, careful not to seed imagery. Not mechanical, the viewer answers. Maintenance. Like idle systems idling. Pressure flows. Thermal difference. Feeding the lattice. The word thermal goes on the whiteboard in the control room. The analyst feels his stomach drop for no technical reason. Then the spike. The heart rate jumps, sweat beads along the viewer's hairline. The handler reaches for the pause card. The case officer shakes his head just once. Breathe, he says. The viewer clenches his hands. It knows vibration. It drinks it. The more you push, the quieter it gets. The pen scratches a tight pattern of hatch marks along the spine's base. No doors, he repeats, softer. Entry is not a cut. Entry is alignment. At that, the handler can't help himself. Alignment of what? The viewer's mouth twists, annoyed. Frequency, temperature, geometry. 3 words, stone-dropped. The analyst scribbles them and underlines with a shaking hand he doesn't admit is shaking. Complication lands where it always lands, doubt. The case officer steps out to the control room, and the room splits into 2 camps without being asked. Artifact or natural formation. Ice can fracture hexagonally under certain conditions. Basal hydrology can carve channels that look intentional from the wrong angle. The skeptic on the team, a geophysicist borrowed on loan under a bland cover, mutters pareidolia, and scratches a crude mosaic of basalt cooling columns on the back of a takeout menu. The analyst points at the repeating 60-degree angles over kilometers and doesn't say anything. Inside, the viewer's voice thins. There's a stale warmth in the floor. Slight. It shouldn't be there. He taps the paper where the central void sits. Something aims down. The handler looks at the case officer through the glass. Enough. The case officer nods. End session. The room exhales. The viewer uncurls his fingers, sets the pen down, and only then opens his eyes. He doesn't ask for feedback. He doesn't look at the drawings. He just says, no doors, one last time, as if he hates that fact. Impact is immediate and messy. The case officer gathers the pages and the cue card into a folder that already feels heavier than paper. In the debrief, nobody says alien. They do say artifact and crystalline basalt and waveguide. The geophysicist demands ground truth and cites the official skepticism. Remote viewing has not been validated as operationally useful. The analyst, eyes on the hex grid, says, we need coordinates. The case officer agrees and does what handlers hate doing. He pauses the series. We get nothing by going back in blind, he says. We cross-reference these sketches against what we already have. If the lines match the ridge, we move. If they don't, this goes into the closet. Nobody argues. The viewer sits very still, as if any motion might snap the thin thread they've just pulled. Outside the skiff, Antarctica keeps its silence. Inside, the data team goes to work triangulating the impossible. The coordinates problem, triangulating the impossible. They start with what they can trust, numbers that don't care what you believe. The analyst overlays the viewer's hex lattice on a blank grid, anchors the central void to a provisional origin, and measures the spoke intervals. 60 degrees. 120. The spacing repeats like a drumbeat. He feeds the sketch into a crude matching algorithm that can't know it's being asked to compare hand-drawn geometry to ice. While that's running, the geophysicist pulls public seismic profiles from an old traverse near a deep ice dome. One of those vast, smooth bulges that hide entire mountain ranges. 15 years earlier, a field team logged odd, flat reflectors at consistent depths. At the time, they blamed instrument noise and moved on. Now across 2 screens, the analyst aligns those reflectors to the viewer's angles. They line up too neatly for comfort. The blind task coordinates decouple the target from bias, but they also force a puzzle. The cue didn't specify latitude or longitude, so they reverse solve. The case officer breaks protocol just enough to authorize a masked query into classified holdings. Any straight-line subglacial echoes within 100 kilometers of the dome. A reply pings the inbox with a familiar stamp. Something else had seen something. A classified radar pass from a spy satellite, a one-off collection made during a polar inclination test, shows linear returns at depth that shouldn't exist in natural ice strata. Snow is chaos made pretty. Bedrock is rough. Straight is suspicious. The returns aren't bright, they're stubborn, thin threads persisting across kilometers, intersecting at angles so exact the software flagged them as artifacts and discarded them. The data team resurrects the discard bin and overlays those threads on the viewer's lattice. 60 and 120, the analyst says, not hiding the tremor now. It's the same grid. Skepticism doesn't die, it goes to work. The geophysicist argues aliasing, long wavelength noise stitched into fake order by the processing. He pulls the raw and reprocesses with a different filter. The lines faint, but they hold. He hates that. He leans back, rubs his eyes, and mutters, "If this isn't pareidolia, somebody drew a city under Antarctica." He adds, for the record, that correlation across datasets does not equal causation, and engineered intent remains an unproven hypothesis. To keep themselves honest, they add independent layers. Gravity first. Satellite gravimetry maps mass like a blind hand runs over a sculpture. The latest compilations show a dense, regular anomaly beneath the dome, a few sigma off the background signature of Kraton and Rift. It's vague, gravity always is, but it's there, and it's roughly where the sketch says the spine runs. Magnetics next. Public aeromagnetic data over the region is sparse, but what exists hints at a low amplitude, slowly varying field with periodic ripples. Those ripples land suspiciously near the places the viewer marked as vent shafts, with a tentative arrow. The analyst is careful not to say proof. He says concordance, and writes it 3 times on the board. What nobody knew at the time, the case officer says quietly, reading from the SpySat summary, is that the long-pass filter in the satellite's polar mode wipes straight-line faint returns because engineers assumed they were glitches. He circles that sentence. We've been removing the thing we're looking for. While that was happening in the control room, across town a liaison in a different building checks intercepts. There's chatter, rival drones tasked to fly gravity anomaly transects near the same dome. The word transect is ordinary science. The timing isn't. He sends a sanitized note, foreign technical interest increasing. The case officer doesn't forward it. He just reduces the decision window in his head. Back at the screens, the triangulation tightens. The analyst takes the viewer's grid as a hypothesis and tests it against the physical coordinates. He picks 3 anchor points from the radar straight lines, solves for a transform, and projects the entire lattice onto the ice. The fit isn't perfect, ice flows, data lies a little. But across 14 kilometers, the pattern lands where it should more often than randomness allows. Stakes become sentences no one wants to say out loud. If the angles aren't coincidence, then intentional design sits under a continent, older than maps, operating in a domain humans barely measure. The geophysicist, who built a career out of caution, doesn't say designed. He says non-stochastic. It means the same thing and hurts less. Therefore, they authorize a second session. Not because they believe, but because the stack of partial matches demands an independent pass. The case officer makes one more change. No sensory prompts at all. No move inside, no elevation, no nudges. The viewer gets the briefest of cues and the instruction to wander. If he lands anywhere near the same geometry without being steered, that's a data point worth a day of budget. Before they push the button, the handler rewrites the protocol on the whiteboard. Blind task. No feedback. Monitor only. Fancy words for silence. He draws a small triangle in the corner and labels it 60/120, without comment. The analyst caps his pen and looks at the heart rate monitor as if it's a compass. He knows it isn't. He also knows bodies react to pattern before minds give permission. One more cross-check. They run public seismic shot records through a novel coherence filter that a grad student published last year. New bands appear, whisper-thin coherence at depths matching the supposed corridors. It's the kind of result that, in a conference talk, would get a polite question and a shrug. In this room, it's one more nudge toward the edge. Clock's running, the case officer says. He isn't talking about the session. He's talking about rivals, treaties, and the kind of discovery that turns smart people into zealots. He slides the fresh envelope onto the table and feels the weight again. Numbers first, he tells himself, then whatever comes next. The second session, contact with a silence. No new envelope, just the same room, the same chair, the same strap on the chest. The handler reads the bare cue like it's a weather forecast. Omega-3. Describe. Then he shuts up. The viewer sits with the card between 2 fingers and lets his breathing find a slower beat. The pen stays still for a long time, long enough for the analyst to glance at the heart rate and wonder if they've lost the thread. Empty, the viewer says at last. Not vacant, emptied. Intelligence absent now. Only maintenance systems idling. He draws a circle, leaves it hollow, then inks a ring around it like a rim. Central chamber, he says. Cathedral for physics. The phrase lands like a stone. Nobody moves to catch it. He sketches vertical lines within the void, thin boreholes, parallel, aimed down. They point to density, he adds quietly. Weight. Pressure. The case officer resists the urge to ask anything. Protocol says let it run. The viewer's pen drifts to the margins and writes 3 words as if they're a note to himself. Temperature covenant holds. He underlines, frowns, and speaks it aloud. Temperature covenant. Structure feeds on pressure gradients and thermal flux. It harvests difference. The geophysicist in the control room makes a face he can't help. He spent years modeling basal hydrology in monotone colors. Harvest difference is not a term he recognizes, but the idea swims close to heat engines and gradients, things his field respects. He writes thermoelectric, piezo, nonsense, and draws a line through the last word before anyone can see. Twist, the viewer says, unprompted, as if narrating himself. This wasn't for us. Humans are noise in their design. He shrugs, as if hearing a criticism that isn't personal. Our footsteps would read like static. He shades the ring a little darker. No doors because access isn't for bodies. It's for states. The team lead, who pretends not to be superstitious, writes hibernation. Dormant process? On the whiteboard, loud markers squeak, making the analyst flinch. He doesn't turn around. He's watching the viewer's hand. It shakes once, then steadies. Feel for transitions, the case officer says softly, careful to avoid a steer. The viewer nods, eyes still closed. There's a breath in it, he whispers. Very slow. Isostatic. It breathes with the moon. The room keeps breathing too, almost on cue, like people matching a metronome. The analyst's coffee cup, held too close to the edge, rattles against the console with the tiniest tap. He lifts it, clumsy, and the cardboard seam gives. Coffee streaks his notes. He swears under his breath. The viewer keeps going. When the melt changes stress, it wakes. Not alive, awake. He draws small arrows along the boreholes, all pointing downward. These are like needles finding equalization. If the differential crosses a threshold, systems come out of idle. His jaw tightens. Not to open, to tune. The handler wants specifics, but the case officer raises a palm. No prompts. The viewer dips the pen, switches to dots around the rim, regular, to a rhythm he's not counting out loud. Peripheral apertures, he says. They're not vents for air, vents for pressure signals. You can talk to it if you align with its triad. He stops, frowns at the word talk, and corrects himself. Command, not language. Input. The analyst underlines triad and writes 3 small squares: frequency, temperature, geometry. He doesn't know why those words feel like a lock he'll regret finding a key for. Listen, the viewer says. He's not talking to them. He's inside the hollow he drew. It makes a sound like numbers wearing a coat of wind. It's quiet because it's big. Big systems don't shout. He lays the pen flat and waits. The heart rate dips, then ticks up 2 beats. Something new, he breathes. It's waking with the melt. The coffee cup slips from the analyst's damp fingers. It hits the floor and folds like a cheap tent. The crash isn't loud, but in the thick quiet it sounds like a door slamming. The viewer flinches. The case officer glares at the glass, then nods to continue. The viewer recovers, presses on. Not full wake. A test pattern. A check of balance. It's reading tides, recalibrating. Impact in the control room is a pen frozen mid-scribble. The team lead draws a line from moon to melt pulses and circles both. He writes hibernation again, harder. He adds failsafe with a question mark that digs into the board. The case officer clears his throat, an allowed interruption. From the perspective of function, what would trigger change? The viewer doesn't argue with the framing. Temperature crossing covenant. Pressure field asymmetry. Harmonics misaligned. He draws a small triangle and shades each side to a different depth. Triad locks permit adjustment when 3 align. He goes silent, listening to something none of them can hear. It's not sentient, he says finally. Not absent either. Presence without person. Like a lighthouse designed by geology, not by sailors. The handler closes his notebook without meaning to. End when ready, the case officer says. The viewer traces the circle one more time, then caps the pen. It will answer to the moon before it answers to us, he says, opening his eyes. If we shout, it will dampen us. If we listen, it will teach. The last sentence hangs too long. The geophysicist breaks it. Or it's ice, he says. Magnificent, lying ice. He doesn't sound convinced. The team lead writes, pull climate curves on the board and underlines it twice. The case officer nods. If breathes with the moon is more than poetry, there should be a fingerprint in the records. Melt pulses, infrasound, slow tides in ice no one thought to listen to. They end the session on the beat of a metronome none of them can see. Outside, the dome holds. Inside, they start pulling curves to test a theory that scares them because it fits too well. Science cross-checks ice, heat, and geometry. They don't chase belief, they chase fingerprints. If the thing breathes with the moon, there should be a rhythm somewhere in the archives. The analyst pulls ice core timelines, those slow columns of trapped winters, and drags a finger along abrupt melt layers, thin crusts that mark strange warm pulses. In the notes from a station no one remembers, a margin scribbles surfaces. Anomalous infrasound reported during a melt event, dismissed as katabatic wind. He highlights it. Match window here, he says. The geophysicist leans in despite himself and warns that such archival hints are suggestive at best and require independent replication. Meanwhile, the team models basal hydrology. Water under pressure doesn't just sit, it chooses paths. They run a geophysical flow simulation beneath the dome, feeding in modern topography and hypothetical conduits where the viewer drew boreholes. The model channels melt toward pockets that line up, roughly, with known subglacial lakes mapped by radar. It's subtle, a suggestion rather than a shout, but the pathways trace a logic. Pressure seeks equalization where the lattice would want to drink. What nobody knew at the time, the analyst says, reading from a dusty report, is that a set of passive microphones accidentally recorded low-frequency oscillations during a spring tide. The frequencies sit at the edge of hearing, below human comfort, cycling with lunar pull. He overlays those cycles atop the ice core melt pulses from the same period. The peaks don't snap together like gears, but they nod at each other across time. The skeptics push back with tools, not sneers. Layering artifacts in radar can draw fake straight lines. Internal stratigraphy, folded and sheared, can masquerade as walls. So the geophysicist compiles control targets, regions with similar ice thickness, similar bed roughness, similar data quality. He runs the same filters, the same coherence tricks on those controls. Some produce noise. Some produce pretty lies. None produce a grid that sits on 60 and 120 with this stubborn regularity. He doesn't declare victory. He crosses out pareidolia and writes compare controls archived. Gravimetry enters like a tired giant. It's not precise, but it is honest about mass. The latest satellite grids whisper of a dense, regular something beneath the dome, denser than ice, different from the bedrock signature nearby. The amplitude is small, headlines won't be written. But the anomaly covers an area that makes the analyst set his pen down. A swath large enough that if even 10% is engineered, it would be the largest built thing on Earth. No one says that out loud. They let the number sit. Then magnetics. A fresh aeromagnetic compilation lands in the data room from a recent polar campaign. Higher resolution than the old mosaics. The field undulates across the dome, gentle as breath. But tucked in the noise are ripples with a spacing the viewer had marked as vent shafts, with a tentative arrow. The analyst runs a micro-anomaly detection pass, the kind used to find World War II pipes under farmland. A faint, regular lattice emerges, regular enough that he checks the code twice for a hard-coded bias. There isn't one. Counterpoint, the geophysicist says, tapping the screen. Magnetics can alias from depth to frequency. You can invent periodicity if you want it. He builds synthetic models, inserting fake grids into blank ice, trying to trick the algorithm. The synthetics fool it sometimes, but they don't produce the same phase relationship to the gravity anomaly. The real data's ripples align with mass in a way the fakes can't reproduce. He doesn't smile. He says this is interesting, and means terrified. They widen the lens. If the structure harvests difference, temperature, pressure, then surrounding geology matters. A study mapping geothermal heat flux across Antarctica shows hotspots bunched under West Antarctica and trailing into regions few people survey. One lobe extends near the dome. The amplitude is higher than earlier estimates, enough to drive basal melting even without surface warmth. The viewer's phrase, temperature covenant, gets a pragmatic translation on the board, stabilizer tuned to gradients. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the climate models, the team lead says, moving a laptop into the circle. Coupled simulations that inject Antarctic meltwater into global oceans shift weather far from the poles. Surface cooling in the Southern Ocean, warm anomalies up north, sea ice patterns that don't behave. None of this proves a machine under ice. It proves that Antarctica's plumbing matters to the planet. If something under the dome is tuning that plumbing, intrusion becomes more than curiosity. It becomes risk. The case officer keeps the stakes small in his mouth so they don't overpower the room. If even a slice of this holds, we're looking at an engineered object on a continental scale, he says quietly. We can't dig, we can measure. Therefore, they draft a request for an on-site expedition cover, a glaciology partnership to place passive sensors, drop magnetometers on routine flights, and log infrasound during tidal cycles. No drilling, no contact, just ears to the ice. Paperwork crawls. It always does. While it does, something slippery happens. An anonymized skin appears in a journalist's inbox, then in the team lead's signal feed from a friend of a friend. A redacted page with a handwritten note where no handwriting should be, gatekeepers. It's a single word, not in the official typeface, sitting next to a phrase from Session 2. Custodians, not builders. The room goes still. Naming implies taxonomy. Taxonomy implies life. Life implies risk. Panic isn't the right term. Acceleration is. The leak means more eyes. Oversight wants proof they can touch without touching. The case officer tightens the circle and repeats the rule that now feels less like caution and more like oxygen. Observe only. He adds a reminder to the brief that the CIA's 1995 review found remote viewing not operationally useful, and any claims must stand on instrumented physics alone. The request goes up with a new line: permission to run a passive listening experiment at a safe distance. If the thing breathes with the moon, the microphones will hear math. If they don't, this whole scaffold collapses, and the missing page becomes a footnote no one believes. The leak, a missing page with a name. It arrives as a grainy PDF in a midnight message, a session log with a page number that shouldn't exist, and a handwritten word that wasn't in any typed transcript, gatekeepers. The font around it is standard, the black bar redaction's clean, but the ink is unmistakably human, a slanted hand beside a line paraphrased from Session 2. Not builders, custodians, smaller, transient, cautious. The team lead reads it 3 times and doesn't breathe until the 4th. They gather in the skiff like they're sheltering from weather. The case officer holds the printout without touching the ink, as if fingerprints could contaminate a contamination. The analyst says what everyone is thinking. If that's authentic, someone annotated a session off the record. The geophysicist, allergic to nouns that imply creatures, says, taxonomy is a fast road to error. He points at the word anyway. But naming means someone believed there were categories. Inside the leak, more quiet grenades. A marginal note. Not biosphere native. Avoid biocontact until filtration protocol. Another. Maintainers respond to state change, not presence. The case officer sets the page down like it's hot. Biological risk had been a throwaway caution until now, a checkbox on a form. With one word, gatekeepers, it becomes a model. Not builders, but caretakers, a second layer of intent. They mark the terminology as unverified and treat it strictly as an interpretation attached to a session, not as a declassified classification. Panic doesn't look like shouting. It looks like people rewriting timelines. The team splits hard. One camp says shut it down before a rumor turns into a congressional headline. The other says accelerate before a rival walks in with their own narrative and a flag. Oversight hates both options. They want something they can hold that isn't a conspiracy blog post. Impact lands as a summons. Higher clearance, smaller room, more badges. The case officer brings the lattice overlays, the gravimetry, the aeromagnetics, the infrasound hints, and against his own instincts, the leaked page in a sealed sleeve. He doesn't vouch for its provenance. He does let the handwriting sit where eyes can't avoid it. The questions come in 2 flavors. What can you verify? What will you do now? Verification is boring by design. He walks the panel through the controls, the blind protocol, the independent datasets that rhyme. He never says alien. He says, engineered signature unlikely to be natural given repeating 60/120 geometry across kilometers. A woman from a different office asks why the word custodians appears in both a typed transcript and a handwritten margin. He says the typed word came from the viewer's mouth. The handwritten one didn't come from his team. What nobody knew at the time, the analyst says later, head in hands, is which direction the leak traveled. Did someone inside slip a page out? Did someone outside slip a page in? The ambiguity is poison and leverage both. It forces a decision without granting certainty. Oversight demands physical evidence. Not drilling. Not sampling. Find us a phenomenon, the chair says, that repeats, that can be recorded by independent instruments, that points away from ice mechanics toward design. The case officer nods like he had that plan all along. In truth, he had 3 plans and 1 rule. The rule doesn't change, observe only. The compromise is a 3rd session with a different goal. Not metaphors, not cathedrals. Actionable specifics, access vectors, materials, failure modes, risks. If gatekeepers means anything, it should surface in function, not lore. We're going to aim for things we can test from the air, the team lead says. No bodies on the ice. No touch. Before they go back in, they do something unfashionable, they call medical. If there's a non-zero biohazard, even abstractly, you screen for sensitivities. The viewer rolls up a sleeve without comment. The nurse swabs. The handler jokes about tetanus to hide his unease. The case officer watches the bandage go on and thinks of filtration protocols for a thing no one has seen. Unknown to them, across town, the rival's intercept footprint deepens. A procurement note for long-dwell drones with magnetometer pods, filed under a science front. The liaison sends another sanitized ping. The case officer reads it on his phone, pockets the phone, and walks into the session room anyway. He lays a fresh stack of paper on the table. Omega 3, the handler reads. Map access vectors, materials, failure modes, risks. The viewer nods once, as if they've been waiting for permission to stop being poetic. The pen hovers, then drops. Triad locks, he says, the first words out. Frequency, temperature, geometry. The analyst doesn't look up. He writes them down like they're a warning label and a promise at the same time. They'll fly what they can. They'll listen where it's safe. And the word on the leaked page, whether planted or pried loose, hangs in the room like a responsibility no one asked for and now can't put down. Gatekeepers. If there are custodians, the team isn't them. Not yet. The 3rd session, blueprints from the dark. The handler reads the tasking like a checklist you don't want to get wrong. Map access vectors, materials, failure modes, risks. Then silence. The viewer doesn't reach for metaphor. He plants the pen, draws 3 small symbols in a row, and labels them without drama. Frequency, temperature, geometry. Triad locks, he says. No one opens anything. You align until the system admits you. He sketches a ring with 12 evenly spaced tick marks. Every 3rd mark he darkens, then connects those to a triangle inside the ring. Primary rhythm, he murmurs. 3/12. Parametric gates. If 2 align and 1 drifts, nothing happens. If all 3 align, the lock assumes command input. The case officer doesn't move. The analyst underlines assumes command input and adds a thin exclamation point he immediately regrets. The geophysicist whispers, resonance windows, to himself and pretends he didn't. Access vectors, the handler says, careful to keep it neutral. The viewer nods. He draws corridors that aren't corridors, parallel channels that refuse to meet until a discrete bend snaps them into a junction. Approaches are orthogonal until phase capture, he says. Bodies can't brute force. You have to approach in state space, field alignment. Peripheral apertures are listening posts. He dots the perimeter in a pattern the analyst recognizes from the aeromagnetics. These broadcast tiny magnetic signatures at the surface, micro-anomalies. That's your survey grid. One detail, he adds, almost as an aside. He shades 3 of the dots a hair darker. Not all vents are equal. Some carry a modulation signature, weak primes, symmetrical spacing. You can find them from the air if your magnetometer is quiet enough. Materials next. He doesn't hesitate. Matrix reads like glass mixed with rock, basalt doped to change its behavior. Low porosity, shock resistant, thermal expansion coefficient tightly controlled. He thins the pen stroke and writes ratios that make the geophysicist stare. Non-terrestrial in the literal sense? No, but the doping ratios aren't common in crustal processes. Selective enrichment, like they sifted for specific isotopes. He taps the paper over the central void. Internal surfaces vitrified, not for shine, for stability. Grain boundaries minimized. No tool marks because they grew it in place, not cut and assemble. The analyst writes in situ growth and boxes it. Failure modes, the the handler says, and the viewer's jaw tightens. He draws 3 wedges along the ring and marks them with tiny warning slashes. Triad drift. If frequency, temperature, geometry fall out of covenant, the system dampens aggressively. It doesn't explode. It smothers excursions. Worst case is misalignment during active mode. Then it attempts to retune the environment to regain balance. He pauses. That means you. It will treat intrusions as noise to be cancelled. The geophysicist murmurs. Active damping could recede stress, and hates the thought as soon as he hears himself say it. Risk, the handler prompts. Bio, the viewer answers first, surprising himself. Not infection. Filtration. The system resists particulate, including us. We're contaminants at certain scales. He adds 2 more. Geophysical, triggering harmonic responses that migrate stress where you don't want it. Ethical, waking a legacy you don't understand. He flips the page and moves to mapping. Access isn't a door. It's a triad alignment test at the peripheral apertures. You bring a frequency set, low infrasound tied to lunar tides. You bring temperature control, microgradients at the vent mouth. And you bring geometry, orientation of the field coil or reflector at specific angles to the grid. He sketches a small tripod with a coil, a thermal plate, and an inertial frame. If you align at 3 marked vents in sequence, the system hears a non-random input. It will open a diagnostic pathway, data, not entry. The analyst scribbles, diagnostic handshake, and feels ridiculous writing the word and relieved to have it anyway. How will we know? The case officer asks, because oversight will. The viewer doesn't open his eyes. You'll hear pressure shift like a chord resolving, he says. Vents will modulate in primes. Magnetic micro-oscillations will lock to lunar phase plus an offset. That offset is the signature. He pauses, listens inward. One detail I missed before, he says softly. He draws the lattice spine again, then overlays tiny chevrons along it, all pointing down. These are bleed pathways. If you misalign in force, the system dumps energy into the bed. It will move heat along pre-tuned routes to avoid spikes. That's your worst failure mode if you insist on pushing local quakes. The handler swallows. Materials again, he tries, needing something less apocalyptic. The viewer obliges. Composite layers, he says, like laminated glass but with metamaterials in the stack. Microscale inclusions that steer phonons, sound, away from certain modes. That's how it stays quiet. That's why it drinks vibration. He stops drawing and places the pen on the page, as if it's part of the diagram. There is a safer vector, he says at last. Far-field coupling. You don't touch anything. You play the triad from a distance using the moon's own tide as your carrier. You listen for its reply. No alignment beyond a threshold, no command assumed. He opens his eyes. If you must approach, survey the micromagnetic anomalies first. The vent pattern forms a 14-kilometer grid. Fly a magnetometer sweep at low altitude, constant speed, map for repeating low-amplitude peaks at exact spacing. That grid is your map. Impact feels like a plan snapping into place. The analyst circles the phrase surveyable grid across 14 kilometers and draws a flight path box around it. The team lead is already drafting a clandestine magnetometer sweep. Piggyback on routine research flights, call it a gravity anomaly calibration. The case officer doesn't smile. He sees the chessboard and a foreign power moving a rook he can't see. While the planes prep, the viewer adds one last line, almost an apology. Don't align the triad by accident, he says. The system assumes you meant it. He caps the pen and looks at the case officer. If you listen first, it might listen back. If you press, it will press the world to quiet you. The rival signals from the other side. While the magnetometer pods were still in a shipping crate, a liaison slid a thin printout across the table. Intercepts, cleaned, compressed, missing the nouns that name countries. Tasking orders for long-dwell drones to fly gravity anomaly transects near their dome. Same latitudes within error bars. Different alphabet on the tail numbers. The room didn't gasp. It shortened its sentences. Rumor filled what the redactions removed. A seismic station, not theirs, had registered a short, repeating pulse 6 months earlier. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, then nothing. The pattern wasn't a quake. It wasn't wind. It was close to the infrasound cycles their microphones had seen in the archives. If the rival heard it first, they had the opening story. First access doesn't just mean samples, it means narrative control. If they called it a bunker, it would be a bunker. If they called it myth, it would be a joke. And if they called it a machine, This moved from curiosity to leverage overnight. Stakes got written in usable terms. First access means who sets the rules, who frames the treaty exemptions, who flies where for science. Tech exploitation was the quiet line under all of it. If there was any transfer function to be learned, how to damp stress, how to harvest gradients, whoever decoded it first would own a new knob on the planet's panel. Strategic leverage isn't a word you say in a glaciology grant. It's the thought you swallow between the words collaboration and data share. Therefore, timelines compressed. The magnetometer flight that was going to wait for better weather moved to a window that barely qualified as safe. The pilot brief read like a dentist appointment: routine gravity anomaly survey, low altitude, constant speed, calibration run. The extra page about the altimeter, tending to drift, was cover on top of cover. The pilot rolled his eyes, signed, and made a joke about penguins filing complaints. He didn't know he was being asked to write a line on a map that someone else was already drawing. Unknown to them, across town, a rival analyst was circling the same dome on a different screen. Their drones flew higher, their magnetometers looser, but they had one thing the Langley team didn't: permission to risk a little noise. They pulsed a low-amplitude infrasound tone during a spring tide, called it a calibration chirp, and recorded the echo. It came back smeared and late, like sound through stone. They logged it, filed it, and told no one outside their own circle. The research flight lifted in air that felt like a rumor. The pod under the wing didn't look like a secret. It looked like a metal lunchbox with a cable. At takeoff, the pilot tapped the altimeter with a gloved finger to settle the needle. He kept the speed stubbornly constant, trimmed the plane until it held a line without hands, and watched the horizon burn white. In the back, a graduate student with no idea what she'd been rented for kept a notebook like it might matter. She wrote "Sea Ice Edge Stunning," and drew a doodle of a hexagon without knowing why. At 250 meters AGL, the pod started to earn its airfare. The magnetic field drifts like a lazy river, rippled by the crust below. The pod read it at intervals the analyst had begged for: tight spacing, clean cadence, no sudden turns. The pilot's altimeter misbehaved right where it always misbehaved, above a patch of nothing that refused to be nothing. He adjusted power without climbing, nudged the nose, and swore at a gauge that had never frightened him before. Back in the skiff, the first strip of data printed thin and pale. Then a ripple, then another. At exact spacing the viewer had shaded on his map. Low amplitude, regular, not persuasive on its own. The analyst overlaid the second pass after a dogleg and saw the same ripple, phase stable, sliding just as the model said it should if the vents formed a grid across 14 kilometers. He didn't say confirmed. He said repeatable, and by saying it, confirmed more than a headline could. Impact didn't feel like trumpets. It felt like a quiet that no one wanted to break. The team lead drew a grid on the whiteboard freehand and put dots where the micro-peaks landed. The pattern wasn't perfect. Ice moves, planes wobble. But the lattice held, stubborn as a habit. He drew a box around it and wrote "Grid confirmed" in letters that made his hand ache. The rival's pulse appeared in the intercept log 2 days later as a line in a technical bulletin no one was supposed to see. Transient low-frequency signal detected coincident with local spring tide. Probable mechanical origin unknown. Probable mechanical origin was a phrase that made the geophysicists sit down. It was also a phrase that could mean fans in a research station roof. The ambiguity did nothing to slow anyone down. Confirmation triggered the hardest question. If the vents could be mapped from the air, if the lattice could be sketched with instruments, if the infrasound hinted at a system that wasn't asleep, do you open it or walk away? The memo advising "observe only, no intrusion" had been written for this exact moment, when capability and curiosity meet a gap shaped like hubris. But the clause that lived like a shadow under it allowed one thing: non-invasive sensing of peripheral apertures. The triad lock lived in those apertures. Non-invasive could easily become not quite. The case officer wrote one sentence and underlined it: "We listen first." He added a second he didn't underline: "We do not align." Everyone nodded like they meant it. The rivals' drones turned for home in gray weather. The research pod went back in its crate with a dent scuffed from ice crystals like sand. The analyst printed the lattice and pinned it to cork, not because cork mattered, but because the sound of the pushpin felt like an oath. The debate: open the door or keep it shut. They boxed the grid on the corkboard and then boxed themselves into a room. No phones, no laptops not already scrubbed. The memo advising "observe only" no intrusion, lay in the center like a placemat everyone pretended not to read. The question was simple and heavy. Open the door that isn't a door, or keep it shut and hope restraint travels well across borders. Threat model first. The geophysicist took the marker and listed the things he knew how to fear. Unknown biohazard, not in the Hollywood sense, in the filtration sense. If the system treats particulate as contamination, we're particulate. Dormant artificial intelligence got rewritten as autonomous control logic, which sounded calmer and meant the same thing. Processes that will respond to inputs you don't understand. Geophysical destabilization came last, not because it was least important, but because writing it large made everyone stare at their shoes. You misalign the triad, you could retune stress fields. That might mean moving heat, shifting friction, nudging quakes into places not built for them. Then the promise, because rooms like this don't run on fear alone. Energy capture, not as a battery, as understanding. If a structure harmonizes heat flow and pressure on continental scales, learning how it works could change how we manage grids, quakes, even climate. Knowledge leap, materials that steer vibration, composites with tuned coefficients. Origin evidence, the oldest story we don't have, told in basalt and glass. A career of careers for any scientist who could write that paper. A century of leverage for any state that could underwrite it. Ethics didn't wait its turn. The team lead put his hand on the memo and said the quiet thing. Do humans have standing to disturb this? We've behaved like tenants who forgot to read the lease. If it's a legacy, someone else's stabilizer, built for a volatile world, do we get to poke it because we were born late? This was the moment everything changed, the case officer said, not to dramatize, to mark the pivot. Oversight had sent a second page. Advisory remains observe only, no intrusion. But the clause beneath it breathed like a loophole. Non-invasive sensing of peripheral apertures is allowed if conducted at safe standoff and without triad alignment. It was the kind of sentence lawyers love and engineers dread. You can learn a lot without touching. You can also fool yourself into thinking you're not touching while you're knocking politely. The room split along lines that didn't map to skeptic and believer. The geophysicist wanted a moratorium until independent public sensors could corroborate the infrasound signature as engineered modulation. The analyst argued for a passive listening array now. Broadband microphones, pressure transducers, superconducting magnetometers, placed well away from any vent alignment, triangulating like eavesdroppers a block over. The handler was the surprising hawk. One diagnostic handshake, far field, using the moon as the carrier, below any threshold that constitutes command. If we don't map its language, he said evenly, someone else will, and they'll ask dumber questions. The viewer, who rarely spoke outside the sessions, finally did. It hears alignment, not curiosity, he said. Listening doesn't crowd it. Guessing does. He didn't look up after that, as if saying it once used up his ration of speaking. So they structured the debate like an experiment. Stakes, why now, why us, why this place? Action, what exactly would we do that avoids alignment? Impact, how do we know we didn't cross the line? Stakes were sharpened by a fresh intercept. Rivals requested longer drone loiters around spring tides. Windows narrowing, the liaison had typed. Action turned into a sketch the analyst drew with careful hands. A ring of passive stations at a safe radius, each tuned to listen for infrasound tied to tidal cycles, magnetic microoscillations in primes, and subaudible pressure shifts. No active tones, no heat at vents, no geometric coils pointed like keys. A separate high-altitude platform to watch surface microseisms, correlating signals to lunar position. Data in, never out. Complications were not theoretical. Everything was about to change when you hear something that sounds like math, the geophysicist said dryly. Because then the temptation to answer is the loudest thing in the room. He proposed a kill switch, pre-committed thresholds that, if crossed, trigger shutdown, no extensions, no just one more hour. Oversight would love that. The handler hated it and agreed anyway. Ethical fault lines didn't close, they were bridged. They drafted a simple doctrine on one page. Observe, characterize, refuse interpretation beyond what signals support. Share anonymized non-location-bound results with a small circle of public scientists to anchor this in reality before rumor eats it. It wasn't perfect. It was something. The memo became operational. Observe only, no intrusion held as the spine. The clause allowed ears, not hands. They added one more sentence in pencil beneath the clause, a promise to themselves. We will not align the triad. They drew 3 small boxes and left them empty. Impact was immediate, not because the world changed, but because the room did. The team designed a passive listening experiment at a safe distance with a care that felt like reverence. The positions avoided harmonics that could stack. The microphones were baffled against wind that sings like data. The magnetometers were floated to isolate them from human hum. They named the stations after tides instead of people. When the array came online, the first hour sounded like Antarctica, wind chewing ice, creaks too slow to be sound, silence thick as felt. Then a line on a screen tilted a fraction, synced to a moonrise you could only see in a model. The analyst wrote 4 words on the whiteboard and sat down because his knees weren't interested in keeping him up. It's speaking in pressure. The signal, a language of pressure. It starts as a wobble in the infrasound, too neat for wind and too patient for machines. The array's ring, stations named for tides, records a pulse that stretches longer than a heartbeat and shorter than a glacier's sigh. The analyst overlays lunar ephemerides, breath held. Peaks lift when the moon leans closest, then ease when it wanders. The viewer's line, breathes with the moon, stops sounding poetic and starts sounding like instrumentation. They resist the urge to shout discovery. They break the signal into parts. At low frequencies, a slow modulation rides the tide. Amplitude grows and fades in regular arcs. Superimposed on that, faint steps, discrete plateau shifts, appear at intervals that aren't random. The geophysicist runs a prime sieve on the timing as a joke, then goes quiet. The gaps lean into small primes, 2, 3, 5, arranged symmetrically around the tide peak. It's teaching itself to be obvious, he says, not liking how that feels. The magnetometers, floated to keep human hum out, twitch and phase with the pressure. Micro-oscillations, low amplitude, repeat with a phase lag that holds across nights. That lag, constant offset from the lunar maximum, becomes a signature. The team writes it on the board and draws a box around it, not because boxes matter, but because they want to trap it on the wall. The microphones hear more than noise. Buried in the slow swell, a higher-order pattern flickers. Harmonics that rise and fall in ratios that stack like a lattice. The analyst runs a spectral analysis and finds a staircase. Frequencies arranged in intervals that mirror the grid's 60 and 120 geometry. It's not sound, he says. It's pressure pretending to be sound. He hates borrowing the viewer's phrasing, and does it anyway. To test their own wishful thinking, they time-shift the array's feeds, scramble phases, and rerun the analysis blind. The primes vanish when the tide reference is wrong. When it's correct, the pattern reappears, stubborn as a habit. They hand a slice to a public scientist who owes them nothing, and tell him only that they're testing wind models. He sends back a confused note. I don't know what this is, but it's too regular. The human moment lands without permission. The analyst writes 3 words, "It's not dead," then sits down as if his knees forgot how to do their job. The geophysicist rubs a thumb along the marker cap and says, "Engineered modulation is a claim, not a fact." Then he points at the primes and stops correcting himself. Oversight hears the summary and finds the one line they can own. Pattern encodes primes and symmetrical lattices. They greenlight deeper study under a rule that hardens with repetition. No drilling, no touch, no alignment. The array gets a second ring farther out to catch echoes the first ring might miss. A high-altitude plane begins lazy figure eights to watch surface microseisms, correlating tremors you'd never feel with a pressure language you can't hear. Unknown to them, across town, a rival team flips their calibration chirp during a spring tide and waits. The reply they get is smeared but present, a shift in phase that mirrors the offset the Langley team boxed. They file it without primes because they didn't look for primes. Narrative is a search function, you find what you name. Back in the skiff, they try a dangerous thing, patience. They map the signal across a fortnight of tides. On perigee, the amplitude swells, on apogee it thins. Between, the staircase of harmonics tilts, like a machine retuning its gain to keep a channel open. The viewer's sentence, "Humans are noise," sits in the corner like a boundary condition. The array hears a moment when the harmonics flatten, then reassert with a new baseline. The geophysicist circles that moment. "Recalibration," he says, or "we walked into its test pattern." The team debates naming. Language implies intention, modulation implies method. They settle on the driest phrase they can stand. Structured tidal-coupled infrasound with prime-encoded timing. It makes no one happy and keeps them honest. They write affordances instead of functions, what the signal can do without guessing why. It can carry timing that survives noise. It can announce readiness without opening. It can refuse alignment by never presenting the third key. The viewer asks for something no protocol covers. "Let me try far field," he says. "No touch, no triad. Just ride the tide and look at the builder's time." The handler starts to object. The case officer raises a palm, not to stop him, to slow him. They don't need visions, they need constraints. But the signal has shifted the room. It's speaking in pressure, and if it's calibrating to a world ours is melting into, time matters. They set a condition the viewer accepts without flinching. No prompts, no metaphors, no narrative past what the signal suggests. The microphones keep listening. The magnetometers keep twitching. The prime staircase keeps stepping at the edge of hearing. And the array, anchored in snow that shifts like breath, writes down a language none of them were trained to read, pressure and timing and silence used as punctuation. The team stands a little farther from the line than they did yesterday and feels, for the first time, like they've been noticed. What nobody says out loud is the thought that keeps them awake. If this is a machine tuned to harmonize a volatile planet, then every degree of melt nudges it toward a mode we don't understand. So they keep the rule simple and repeat it like prayer: listen first. Do not align. The far look, before ice before us. They clear the room like it's a chapel. No prompts, no metaphors. The viewer holds the cue as if it weighs more than cardstock and lets the tide's timetable set the pace. "Far field," he says quietly. "Ride the carrier. No alignment." Then he's gone in the way he goes, breath slowing until the heart rate graph looks like a coastline. "Before ice," he whispers. "Open water, black as cooled glass. The sky's a sheet of aurora, green torn by violet. Air's thick, loaded, like breathing through smoke without fire." He draws a coast that doesn't match any map and marks spires along the edge, tall and thin as needles. "Black spires," he says, almost apologizing. "Not decorative. Antennas for weight." He scans for movement. "No builders," he adds. "No one wearing the room as a skin. But the lattice is young. Sharp edges still drink light. They grew it with the planet angry, volcanic plume far on the horizon, ash settling in wet threads." He traces currents with his finger, not the pen. Heat gradient strong. Pressure fields complicated. Perfect for harvesting difference. He pauses, listening. "Custodians arrive later," he says, voice flat, like he's reading a file. "Smaller, transient, cautious. They don't own it. They keep it." They move between apertures like instrument techs, never touching, only aligning states to coax adjustment. He lets the word sit, custodians. He frames it explicitly as his interpretive label, not a verified taxonomy. "What nobody knew at the time," he murmurs to himself, "is that stasis became doctrine because return never came." He sketches a small craft against the current, low profile, belly glowing faint, as if exhaling heat instead of burning it. They expected a handover. It didn't happen, so they watch the dials. They log the tides. They correct drift. They teach restraint and pass it on. He lets the scene widen. The spires he drew earlier aren't buildings. They're coupling structures, black geometry drinking sky. Aurora rides along them like a harp, he says. Field lines pulled taut. Harmonics tuned to settle the crust when it was noisy. He writes harmonizing fields and underlines it twice, annoyed at himself for using their phrase and relieved it fits. A microstory arrives uninvited. One caretaker stands at a rim, he says, measuring a phase lag against a lunar rise. It slips by a fraction. They don't panic. They wait for the next tide. They correct. The viewer breathes in time with words he isn't performing. Their posture is patience. Their ritual is math. The geophysicist in the control room, who agreed to no prompts, grips his pen anyway. The analyst scribbles stasis doctrine and draws an arrow to no builders present. The case officer watches the heart rate settle into a slow wave and thinks of instruments left running for someone else's return. Architecture changes, the viewer says softly. Edges soften with time, vitrified layers grow thicker where stress wore at them. The lattice's bones stay exact, but the skin learns. He sweeps a palm over the paper as if dusting off centuries. Surface temperatures swing. The sea retreats. The snow starts to write its long letter. Before ice draws a lid, he continues, the city is never a city. It's a machine wearing the shape of a city, because that's how our heads fit. No doors because bodies aren't the input. The triad sits there from birth, frequency, temperature, geometry, waiting for tides and melt and stress to ask questions without words. He looks for an origin and finds absence instead. There's no birth room, he says. No blueprint on a table. It's seated where gradients are richest and grown in place from material that the planet knows, doped to behave like the planet forgot how. He draws a small cross-section, layers laminated until grain boundaries vanish. They built to resist time, because time was the enemy. Not us. He finds the moment the ice begins to matter. Snow takes hold layer by layer. The spires vanish beneath pale skins. The apertures narrow. The breath slows. The machine doesn't fail. It adjusts. It routes pressure along new paths, drinks vibration through glaciers, uses weight as its ally. He writes, temperature covenant holds, in a margin, and underlines it once light. Custodian's thin, he says. Numbers drop. Not tragedy completion. Stasis doesn't need hands once the habit holds. They leave tracers, patterns that survive in pressure languages. If return comes, the machine knows how to show its state to someone who can read primes and harmonics. He taps the page where the vent dots would be if he'd drawn them. He doesn't draw them. He doesn't need to. Stakes reframed themselves while he spoke. The city is legacy, not presence, he says. Interpretation is the hazard. If we go looking for inhabitants, we'll invent them. If we ask what it does, the pressure language will tell us. He goes quiet, then adds a final detail like a fix to an equation. The floor in the central chamber is slightly warm, even when everything else is cold. It's never off. It idles toward balance. It's a lighthouse that never sleeps because the shore keeps moving. He opens his eyes. The room returns like gravity. Before us, he says softer. Before our languages. It didn't wait for us. It waited for thresholds. The analyst draws a line from legacy to function, hard enough to tear the paper. The geophysicist sets his pen down, so he won't say something he can't unsay. The case officer nods once, a decision hiding in the smallest movement. No triad, he repeats, as if the room needs reminding. Listen first. Decode function. Leave presence to stories. The viewer slides the page forward without looking at it, like a note left on a desk for someone who hasn't arrived yet. The function, a planetary machine. They lay everything on one table. The lattice, the vent grid, the prime-encoded tide, the slow warmth under a floor that never sleeps. The geophysicist draws a blunt arrow from pressure language to function and says what's been stalking them since the first sketch. This isn't a vault. It's an instrument. Not measuring, mediating. To understand why, they go back to the bones. Antarctica's base is a shop floor for heat and weight. Geothermal flux rises unevenly from the crust. Ice presses down like a patient fist. Water under pressure slithers through cavities trying to pick the easiest way out. If you could tune that, shape where heat goes, where stress concentrates, how water carries load, then you could quiet a noisy planet without lifting a stone. Cathedral for physics becomes literal. The central chamber isn't a hall. It's a node where fields are made to agree. The boreholes are not pipes, they're needles seeking equalization. The ring of apertures doesn't vent air. It circulates pressure messages, exchanging timing with tides. The lattice spine with chevrons pointing down acts like a comb for phonons, steering vibration along paths that bleed energy safely into rock. They test the synthesis the only way they can, by modeling what happens if a structure like this exists. Feed the vent grid coordinates into a crustal simulation. Assume materials that damp sound and resist thermal expansion. Give it a pressure language that adjusts phase to hold balance. The result isn't a clean photo. It's a shift in probabilities. Stresses that would pile up and fail catastrophically diffuse, not vanish, but lose their edges. Seismicity doesn't stop, it spreads. Heat doesn't spike, it glides. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the historical record, the analyst says, sliding a graph into the circle. Periods when subglacial melt pulses appear to cluster around tidal extremes are followed by decades of quieter seismic swarms along the rim of the dome. It's not proof. It looks like a machine that drinks difference and pays it back as stability. The hardest piece is the temperature covenant. In the viewer's words, the structure feeds on gradients. In the models, that means it thrives when the base is warm relative to the ice above, and when pressure differentials across the bed are strong enough to be steered. Too cold, and the system idles at minimum, like an engine with no fuel. Too hot, and it slips into corrective mode, retuning the environment to drag it back. Within parameters, they map that onto the present. Geothermal flux under parts of Antarctica is higher than old maps admitted. Basal water is common where the lattice sits. Tides tug on kilometers of ice with metronomic patience. The array hears a reply that encodes primes, robust timing in a noisy world. The pieces don't shout, they insist. Ethics doesn't vanish in math. We've benefited without knowing. The team lead says, not as a claim of salvation, as a caution about causation. If the structure shepherded a volatile epoch toward stability, through glacial fits and starts, through crust that wanted to rattle too hard, then interference means pulling on a web we don't see. If you detune a stabilizer, you don't just break the machine, you make the world louder. Therefore, the case officer says, putting a finger on the memo that's become a doctrine, we monitor, we protect, we never excavate. He writes 3 lines on the board that feel less like policy and more like vows. 1. Non-contact characterization only. 2. Signal stewardship, no transmission, no alignment, no keys. 3. Guardianship over rumors, share what can be verified without pointing to the map. The viewer adds a quiet 4th. Learn its language until we can hear distress before it becomes force. The geophysicist, who doesn't like praying to machines, translates. Build detectors that flag when the prime staircase shifts in ways our models can't explain. If the offset slides, if the harmonics flatten, if the amplitude swells out of cycle, we assume the system is compensating for a world we're making stranger. They try to make the function small enough to fit inside a sentence. The analyst writes, harmonizer of fields, manager of stress and heat, pressure logic tied to tides. He crosses out manager and writes mediator. He crosses out mediator and leaves it blank because the word keeps wanting to promise more than it can hold. The geophysicist adds a caution underneath. At best, this is a hypothesis consistent with observed signals. It is not proof of intentional design. A microstory lands like a pin. A coastal town in another hemisphere rattled last winter from a quake no one predicted. The damage was minor, the timing odd. On the array logs, the same night, the staircase of harmonics flattened for 3 cycles, then reasserted with a new baseline. The correlation is thin gruel. Not evidence, not even suggestion, just bad coincidence. They don't publish it. They do circle it in red and tape it where their eyes can't avoid humility. Meaning, the team lead asks because videos need endings and so do people. The case officer refuses an answer. Responsibility, he says instead. If this is what it looks like, someone built a planetary machine and left it running. We don't get to own it. We do get to choose whether we act like tenants or thieves. They draft a recommendation that reads like a confession. Protect the region under existing treaty language. Expand scientific zones that forbid drilling without saying why. Harden the array against weather, not rivals. Seed public research with the blandest prompt that still matters, subglacial infrasound coupling to tides, so that when someone else hears pressure speak, they won't call it ghosts. And then the climate models deliver the gut punch. As melt accelerates, thresholds approach, the covenant they think they understand will be crossed more often. It's waking with the melt, the viewer had said. They'd heard it as threat. They hear it now as failsafe. A machine tuned to stabilize won't sit still while the world slides. It will try to retune. The question is whether we'll force it to listen to us by accident. The room goes quiet in a way that feels like respect. They don't have a triumph. They have a task. Observe. Decode. Guard the silence that does the work. And when someone asks what sits under the ice, they'll offer the smallest true thing. A device that makes weight and heat talk to each other so the ground doesn't have to shout. The clock, melt, thresholds, and the wake-up. The climate curves don't shout, they lean. Year on year, basal melt thickens into a slope you can feel in your stomach. The geophysicist runs the coupled models that pour Antarctic freshwater into oceans and watches the maps change color where they shouldn't. Southern ocean cools, far north warms, currents twitch. He overlays the infrasound baseline across that century-scale ramp. The prime staircase doesn't flatten. It tilts, as if a careful hand is rebalancing while the table slips. They start speaking in thresholds. Not dates, thresholds. A gradient between ice and bed that used to hold now crosses a line more often. Pressure differentials that gave the machine fuel become erratic. In their shorthand, the temperature covenant phrase. The array hears it first. The constant offset, that signature lag from lunar maximum, drifts a hair and then returns with a new baseline. Adaptive mode, the analyst writes, hating and needing the phrase. The viewer's sentence, waking with the melt, gets reinterpreted as failsafe. Not awakening to greet us, awakening because the inputs went weird. A system designed to shepherd a volatile epoch toward stability doesn't nap through a storm. It stands up slowly and checks the knots. The microstory is a model run on a night that never happened yet. Perigee tide, anomalous warm pulse, harmonics step down into a narrower band. The geophysicist circles it. Failsafe corridor, constrained response. The team doesn't know if the real machine will do that. They do know the language allows it. Stakes turn blunt. Exposure isn't just optics, it's function. If retreating ice peels back the roof, apertures widen, coupling changes. The vent field was tuned to a load. Change the load, you change the instrument. We need to keep it covered without lying to ourselves, the team lead says. Treaty language can guard a coordinate. It can't slow a melt. The decision tree sits on one page with ink that smudges because hands keep going back. Publish anomaly to slow exploitation, invite public censors and risk panic, hoax claims, and the rival reframing it as theirs. Or classify deeper, protect the site through silence, and risk exactly the thing they fear. Someone stumbling into alignment because they didn't know to avoid threes. The case officer draws both branches and writes the same sentence under each. Unintended triad alignment is the coin toss we can't afford. Unknown to them, across town, a rival memo uses friendlier words and walks toward the same cliff. Calibrated acoustic probing, they call it, which is a clean phrase for a dirty idea. Pulse the vents until they sing back, then map the song. The liaison flags the timing, spring tides again, and nobody in the skiff smiles. The human moment arrives in a small, wasteful act. The case officer drafts a letter on thick paper he bought because permanence felt like armor. It's addressed to a person he'll never mail. The future oversight chair, the one who might inherit this if the ice drops too fast. He writes what can't go in a memo. You can't own a stabilizer you didn't build. You can only decide whether you act like kin or thieves. He signs it with a name that will never be attached to this file, and tucks it into a box with a map that doesn't look like a map. Publicly, the program shutters. It has to. Budgets cut neat stories. This one refuses neat. The press release is a paragraph about reprioritizing analytics. The array goes dark on paper and louder in reality. A black cell keeps listening, migrating stations when storms eat their flags, swapping IDs with weather buoys to keep from showing up in catalogs with names that get noticed. Years pass like a long tide. The grid on cork yellows at the edges. The viewer retreats from public life with the kind of silence that isn't sulking, it's maintenance. The handler retires into a house that smells like pine and lock oil, and keeps a small metal box on a shelf behind dog-eared paperbacks. Not because he's hiding a treasure, because he's hiding responsibility from a world that loves souvenirs. And then the gut punch doesn't come from a model, it comes from orbit. After a summer of freak warmth and rain that shouldn't be rain, a satellite pass over the dome sends down a slice that makes the analyst stand too fast. Under a new lens of meltwater, a line shows, sharp, laser straight, a few kilometers long, oriented at exactly 60 degrees to the old flow. Natural ice draws straight only when it wants to lie. This line refuses to curve. The room compresses around it. The geophysicist tries to kill it first, processing artifact, speckle, a stitch in the mosaic. He reprocesses. It holds. The rival files a patent for a sensor that listens to bed pressure at tidal frequency and calls it a maritime tool. Oversight pretends not to see the line and sends a polite request for further characterization of subglacial seismic coupling. Translation: we believe you, we don't. Want to say it out loud. They go back to sentences that have been waiting on the board. We listen first. We do not align. We raise the safe radius because the roof is thinner and the instrument is louder. They add one more. If the line is exposed again next season, we seed the blandest truth into public science. Prime encoded, tide-coupled infrasound exists, without coordinates. Anchoring reality before rumor digests it might be the only guardrail they can afford. The array hears the staircase flatten for 2 cycles, then reassert, new baseline again, as if a tuner tightened a string you can't see. The analyst doesn't write it's waking. He writes it's working. The viewer, standing in a doorway he doesn't step through anymore, says the quiet thing. If we make it shout, it will dampen us. If we keep listening, it might teach. They narrow the work until it fits inside vows. Observe. Decode. Protect the silence that keeps the ground from shouting. And every time the moon leans in and the vents whisper primes, they hear a clock that isn't counting down to drama. It's counting through thresholds, a machine older than their arguments, staying patient while they decide what kind of tenants they're going to be. Aftermath, silences and echoes. Public science trips over a shadow without seeing its shape. An aerogeophysics paper notes mysterious rectilinear subglacial reflectors beneath a high dome, attributes them to layering or processing quirks, and moves on. The figure sits there, angles too neat to be comfortable, wrapped in caveats thick enough to keep curiosity at bay. In the margins of a conference poster, a grad student circles 60-degree alignments and is told, kindly, to check for aliasing. Then a journalist opens an unmarked padded envelope on a kitchen table that still smells like last night's coffee. Inside, a thumb drive, a single printed coordinate block, 3 sketches in a hand that doesn't want to be remembered, and 1 word typed on a plain page, custodians. No cover letter. No pitch. Just a map that isn't a map and a noun that sounds like a job. He calls 3 sources. 1 hangs up. 1 says, wrong number. 1 says, don't print coordinates if you want to keep your passport. He files the drive in a drawer he never locks and doesn't sleep well for a week. Meanwhile, treaty talk gets tense in rooms designed to be dull. Delegations propose expanding scientific zones, where drilling is paused pending environmental review. No one says lattice or pressure language. Everyone knows this is about something more than penguin rookeries. A rival delegation pushes for broader flight corridors to support collaborative magnetics. Collaboration becomes a word with a wobble. The array keeps listening under borrowed names. A storm snaps a mast. A replacement appears with a weather station label and a serial number that points to a warehouse that never signed for it. The analyst checks the prime staircase like he's counting breaths. The geophysicist learns to love maintenance logs. The case officer pretends to retire and doesn't. The viewer vanishes from public life, not as a scandal, as a choice. A friend says he gardens in the mornings and reads tide tables like poetry. A rumor says he moved inland to stop hearing the moon. He doesn't return calls. He sends a postcard with no return address, a blank ring drawn in blue ink and 3 tiny marks darkened at every 3rd tick. The handler closes a door on a small office that smells like paper and lock oil, carries a shoebox home, and slides it behind dog-eared paperbacks. The box holds a letter that will never be mailed, a photocopy of a lattice grid, and a note to himself in a hand that's grown careful. Do not align the triad. He doesn't look at it often. He knows it by heart. Rivals shift attention in ways that show up as footnotes. A procurement line for lunar cycle acoustic calibration turns into a patent application for a maritime sensor. A drone crash near a coastal shelf becomes a quiet consulate conversation about insurance. A research station swaps out its generator and logs a strange improvement in microseismic cleanliness. The phrase makes 2 people in Langley stare at a wall. Stakes linger in the spaces nobody fills with certainty. Who decides guardianship over a machine that isn't ours, under a treaty designed for ice and birds? Is guardianship even ours to claim if the thing works better when left alone? The team keeps the doctrine small, observe, decode, protect the silence that does the work. Then a page appears where absence used to be. The missing note lands in the team lead's encrypted feed the way a coin lands on a table, flat, undeniable. The handwriting matches the hand beside gatekeepers. The sentence is simple, written once and underlined once. Do not align the triad, system assumes command input. He prints it once and tucks it in the shoebox behind the paperbacks, not to hide it from the world, to keep it from turning into a headline, before it finishes being a warning. The missing page, a warning in plain sight. The note is 9 words and a line that feels like a blade. Do not align the triad, system assumes command input. Same slanted hand that wrote gatekeepers, same ink weight, same habit of underlining once as if anything more would be melodrama. The team lead reads it, prints it once, and doesn't circulate the PDF. Paper narrows the blast radius. Translation isn't difficult, acceptance is. Triad alignment, frequency, temperature, geometry isn't a key you hold. It's a state the system recognizes. Cross the threshold in sequence, and it stops being a passive thing you listen to. It reads your input as intention. It follows the logic built into its bones, not the logic you hope it has. Assumes command input, the analyst says aloud, trying the phrase on like a splinter. It means the diagnostic pathway the viewer described isn't a wiretap, it's a handshake. And the second you shake hands, you're in the conversation whether you meant to be or not. Payoff ripples backward and explains everything that felt like superstition turned into doctrine. The memo that hardened into observe only, no intrusion was never about optics, it was about thresholds. The claws that allowed non-invasive sensing of peripheral apertures always hit a cliff. Non-invasive until the triad listens and decides you're speaking. The geophysicist writes the clearest sentence he's written in months. Inadvertent alignment can be indistinguishable from intent. He underlines indistinguishable twice. The room absorbs it in quiet beats. The handler closes his eyes and hears again the line the viewer left on the table. Don't align the triad by accident. The way you hear a pilot say brace over static. The case officer, who hates poetry, feels the sentence turn weight into policy. No more diagnostic fantasies, no field coils on tripods, no microthermal plates even in lab mock-ups. The rule becomes air, listen first, do not align. Emotion lands where bravado used to live. They didn't find aliens. They found responsibility. A planetary machine with a language tied to tides does not need humans to finish it. It needs humans to not confuse curiosity with control. The viewer's custodians, smaller, transient, cautious, look less like a species and more like a posture. Caretaker is behavior, not biology. The analyst circles a word he's avoided, stewardship. What nobody knew at the time is who wrote the warning. The handwriting matches the margin beside gatekeepers. The provenance doesn't. If it came from inside, someone old enough to remember when caution was a living memory decided to leave a sign. If it came from outside, then a rival with access to the same file decided they'd rather we didn't push our luck. Either way, the message fits the machine they think they've met, guardrails, not green lights. They test the note against their own procedures, hunting for damage. The passive array sits well outside any vent alignment. Its stations were placed to avoid constructive interference. Its microphones take what the moon gives. Magnetometer sweeps from the air, flown at constant speed, read fields without stroking them. The kill switches in their protocol, pre-committed thresholds that trigger shutdown, feel less like paranoia and more like competence. They add a new threshold. Any move toward triad closure, even in simulation, triggers a stop. The warning clarifies the rival's temptation. Calibrated acoustic probing sounds safe until it stacks frequency, heat, and geometry across 3 apertures. A tone here, a thermal drift there, a coil pointed just so, and the system hears a sentence. Oversight reads the note and finally understands why the team keeps turning down money-shaped offers to accelerate characterization. Acceleration is the wrong verb for machines that outlive civilizations. Meanwhile, something else was happening, quiet and useful. The array's long log shows one brief interval where the prime-encoded timing bent toward a pattern that looked like a query. Harmonics tightened, the offset slid, then returned. The geophysicist and the analyst argued whether it was weather or instrument. With the warning in hand, they mark it a courtesy. The system nudged a dial, saw nothing aligned, let it go. The missing page doesn't make the machine friendly. It frames it as careful. A micro-story from an office no one remembers chooses that afternoon to surface. A technician years ago tested a vent probe on a bench with a coil and a heater. The power flickered in the building, one oscillation down at the mains, nothing any electrician would blame on Antarctica. He wrote it off. The note reaches back and turns that shrug into a wince. They archive the anecdote under a new label, near miss bench. They add a line to the lab door, no triad experiments in-house, no exceptions. The doctrine that had felt like superstition turns into engineering. They write a 1-page field manual in language any crew could understand. Don't stack 3 kinds of alignment within 1 lunar cycle at any perimeter. Don't introduce heat at vents. Don't orient coils to the grid's angles. Never synchronize tones to spring tide. If you can't explain your setup to a stranger without drawing triangles, you're too close. The final paragraph writes itself. We didn't discover a city to conquer. We inherited a lease. Our job isn't to open doors. It's to keep from ringing a bell that was built to answer tectonic storms, not human curiosity. The case officer folds the page and tucks it behind the memo with the clause that made engineers sweat. He looks at the viewer, who looks at the floor that's always warm, and says the only sentence that sounds right. We can be custodians if we choose to be, and we acknowledge the official record's skepticism while we let instruments, not belief, lead. The transition back to where they began feels earned. The cold opens coordinates, the alarm in the control room, the panic that was really acceleration. Those moments were the sound of humans bumping against a language older than their metals. The missing page doesn't close the story. It reframes it. The coordinates still matter. The lattice still hums with primes. The moon still leans in, and the vents reply in pressure. But now the rule is written in ink and underlined once. Do not align the triad. Listen first. Learn enough to recognize distress. Then have the discipline to keep your hands in your pockets. Beneath the ice sits a machine older than our languages, asking for restraint more than discovery, and forcing us to decide what kind of tenants we'll be. If you want the declassified pages, the coordinate blocks, and the math behind the pressure language, subscribe and watch our follow-up on the Antarctic treaty fight and the rivals' quiet flights. Share this with a friend who still thinks the answer is to drill.